Let's start. And this is a rhetorical quiz. Do you know what your cholesterol is, and are you trying to lower it? And are you taking statins? This is rhetorical, so don't answer. Do you know about the guidelines of the National Cholesterol Education Program? This is the latest. We're actually in 04. And are you using them for yourself, and are you using them taking care of patients? And do you know who developed the guidelines? And do you trust their advice? So let's take a look at these. In July of 04, the sponsors of this guideline program, the National Institutes of Health, the Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, reviewed. What they do, of course, is every time there new information come out, they update the guidelines. And they reviewed these new studies and updated the guidelines based on these new studies. And this is the expert panel, which you'll recognize a lot of impressive, important people. Scott Grundy from Southwestern, Brian Brewer, who at that time was the chief of the molecular disease branch of the Heart Institute, Donald Honeyhockey, who was a pharmacologist from Minnesota, Richard Pasternak, who was from the world's greatest hospital, Sidney Smith, who was former American Heart Association president, and so forth. So these are the kind of the creme de la creme of American medicine. And the guidelines recommend, as you may recall, they recommended more aggressive lowering of LDL for high-risk patients. Also with and by doing that, to do that by lifestyle changes, diet, exercise, but also taking statins. The Therapeutics Initiative at the University of British Columbia at about the same time reviewed the same studies, virtually the same studies, but they came up with different conclusions, and that is the statins were not beneficial in the same patients that the Heart Association guidelines recommended. So, you know, what's going on here? Kind of a bizarre thing. The Canadians are saying no, the Americans are saying yes. Well, this is the disclosure statement from the actual the cholesterol education program. And if you just eyeball it, you can see that all of these people, a lot of them, had conflicts of interest, financial arrangements, honoraria, or consultantships from the companies that make the statins. And if you summarize the data, this is what they look like. Basically, 7 of the 9 people had financial conflicts of interest with the companies that made the statins, and it wasn't just one company, it was 3 to 5 of the companies that they had financial arrangements with. Now, I'll give you a follow-up. This is from the New York Times Science section 2 days ago. Kind of interesting. They point out that several new studies are questioning the NCEP guidelines, that the evidence base for the original recommendations was weak, and some of the original authors have backed off on those recommendations. Now, you know, what's going on here? So the question here, of course, is what did the connection between these authors of the guidelines and industry have to do with their final conclusions? And that's basically the nature of my talk. It's the nature of conflict of interest. I mean, you know, the question is, when someone has a conflict of interest, what is the influence that they have on their judgment? So, you know, the drug company spent in 2003 $24 billion. And when you sit in front of your television, you imagine that all of that is coming at you, Viagra and Cialis or whatever. I don't know about these things, but some of you might. The fact is that almost 90% of it is directed at doctors, and of course it's a lot of journal advertising. This doesn't include, by the way, the 90,000 drug reps that show up in doctors' offices and the corridors of academic medical centers. So they seduce doctors with all kinds of stuff, meals and trips and free samples and personalized items, free continuing medical education. And, you know, I went to a meeting of the American Society of Bone and Mineral Research and gave a talk there, but pretty much the same as this one, a little shorter. The people were wearing these things, and I sat at the top of the escalator, stood at the top of the escalator watching people come up to go to the meeting and counted the number of people who were wearing these lanyards. It turned out that of the first 100 people that came up, 95 of them were wearing the lanyards. The other ones had gotten rid of this thing and were wearing just the name tag. So I asked them how they felt about being human sandwich boards. They laughed less than you did, I can assure you about that. So how common are financial conflicts of interest in medicine? Well, we don't know. I put epidemiology in quotes because we have no idea what the extent of it is. We have surveys that show about 25% of people in the life sciences have important personal financial conflicts. We can tell from consensus panels and from original articles in the New England Journal and JAMA that a lot of people have them. Also from FDA advisory panels when the information is squeezed out of the FDA. And in CME courses, you're required, if you're going to get credit, to disclose your conflicts. But most interesting to me is that the industry has actually admitted it. So this, the Accreditation Council for Continuing Medical Education was trying to prevent people from giving talks if they had financial conflicts at CME meetings. And the Washington Legal Foundation wrote these comments to the ACCME, basically asking them not to do that. And what they said in their letter is right here on the slide, and I'll just read the bottom. It says, it's widely acknowledged that most of the top medical authorities in this country and virtually all of the top speakers on medical topics are employed in some capacity by one or more of the country's pharmaceutical companies. And they said that's how it should be. Well, that's a matter of dispute. But the point is that what this Washington Legal Foundation is hired by the pharmaceutical industry. They know very well what's going on in the pharmaceutical industry. And what they're saying is that just about everybody is conflicted, or at least the top medical authorities. So I base my views on conflict of interest on one simple assumption and four principles. The simple assumption is that even small gifts influence behavior. And the principles are, first, financial considerations should never compromise physician decision-making, either in clinical care or in research. That medical information should be free of bias from financial inducements. That the profession should be accountable for an inordinately high cost of care. So that to the extent that conflicts of interest cause doctors to prescribe the more expensive drugs, then of course that's not particularly good for the public and for the cost of medical care in the country. And lastly, that all financial arrangements should be open and transparent. When you talk to doctors, they say, well, yeah, I understand how you think, but I can't be biased, no matter what the situation is. And in part, you can understand that because they're trained in the scientific method. We have this feeling about evidence-based medicine that we can dissect everything out just perfectly and be completely objective about it. But the fact is that the evidence doesn't show that. And I'll show you just two experiments. One is a study of house officers at UCSF in which they passed around a questionnaire and asked their colleagues whether they could be influenced by pharmaceutical largesse and whether their colleagues could be influenced. So this is what they found, that 39% of them, almost 40%, thought that they personally could be influenced. But they thought that 84% of their colleagues could be influenced. So, I mean, that, you know, that's kind of cute, but I have an experiment that I like even better, which I'd like to show you. And this is done at the Cornell Hotel School. It's really a cute experiment. What they did is they went to an upscale Italian restaurant in New Jersey. Actually, I didn't know that there was an upscale Italian restaurant in New Jersey. And I'm always at risk of doing that because somebody's always from New Jersey, but so be it. So what they did is they gave the waitresses a stack of cards, and they were all arranged in random order. There were 4 different cards in the stack, and what they were told the waitresses to do is pull a card and decide on the basis of the card what to do at the end of the meal. Give no candy, give 1 piece of candy, 2 pieces of candy, or 1 piece, and at the very end, in a very generous way, another piece. And then they measured the tips and correlated them. So this is what they found. No candy, you know, this is upscale, so 19% tips. And with 1 piece, 19.6%, 2 pieces, and so forth. So, you know, this is only candy. This is not an honorarium. This is not $1,000 to give a talk or whatever. This is just candy. So this is kind of the basis for my first view. That is that even small gifts influence behavior, and bigger gifts probably have a greater influence on behavior, although that I'm not sure about. So we've known about this for 400 years, and this comes from Cervantes. He says it's only right that people who receive a benefit show they're grateful, even if it's with trifles. And then Oscar Wilde said, I can resist anything but temptation. So I want to make the point, and this is not to titillate you, this is make a point that there are all kinds of different incentives. So it says you're healthy, but I have to give you a prescription for Toxikill. And it says the drug company's rep is totally hot, and she said she'd take me to lunch if I sell enough of this stuff. Well, that's not a financial inducement. It's another kind, and maybe Jennifer will talk about that. But my point is that I'm going to talk about only financial inducements, and the reason for doing that is that they're optional. You can have one or not have one. You can choose, whereas if you have a religious belief or a sexual belief, you know, that's inside you. You're not going to do much about that, no matter what you do. The fundamental question is, do financial conflicts translate to bias? Because if they do, then that bias could have an influence on the validity, the integrity of our medical information. So let's start by this really interesting study in radiology. What they did is really kind of fascinating. This goes back to 2004 in the journal Acta Radiologica. They took 492 abnormal chest x-rays that had been read by 30 radiologists who had been hired by lawyers who were suing companies for pneumoconiosis. And then they had the films reread by 6 blinded independent a blinded radiologist is not somebody who can't see the films. It's somebody who doesn't know what the other people said about him. And they were all B readers, which means they were all trained in the same fashion to read films in the same way. So what and just look at the top line and the bottom line. So the people who were hired by the lawyers thought that the films showed 96% parenchymal abnormalities, and the independents thought only 5%. And the films were considered normal by none of the hirees, but 38% of the independents. So, you know, you don't need 3 statistical consultants from the Harvard School of Public Health to tell you that there's something fishy about these data. And here's an FDA decision that you all, I'm sure, have heard about Vioxx. So a year ago, the advisory board at the FDA voted on whether to keep Celebrex on the market, whether to allow Vioxx to come back on the market, and whether to keep Bextra on the market. And the vote for Celebrex was pretty straightforward, 31-1. But Vioxx and Bextra were voted to remain on the market. But Vioxx to come back, Bextra to stay. Bextra now has been since removed. Gardner Harris of the New York Times dissected out the data and showed in the middle of the slide that those who had financial conflicts of interest voted 9-1 in favor of keeping Bextra on the market and 9-1 in favor of keeping Vioxx on the market. Those who didn't have financial ties voted the other way around, 8-12, 8-14. And if they had excluded all the people on that FDA panel who had financial conflicts of interest, the vote would have gone the other way. It would have gone against Vioxx and against Spectra. This is kind of irrelevant now because neither of them are on the market, although I'm sure that Merck would love to have Vioxx return. So that's an FDA decision. And here's something that appears in the press, because I think what happens in the public is also relevant to what we do. So this is a probe that you put into the lung bronchoscopically, and what it does, it helps to guide the catheter in the right bronchus. So a doctor called Armin Ernst, who's a pulmonologist at the BI in Boston, says, I think this is one of those techniques that can be groundbreaking. And then another physician named Eric Edel, who has some experience with it, he says definitely an improvement over what's been. Well, there's a difference between groundbreaking and an improvement. It turns out Armin Ernst is a scientific advisor to Superdimension Limited, the Israeli company that makes the device. And here, I'm going to skip Fabry disease. It's just too complicated. So here's continuing medical education. We've looked at guidelines, we've looked at FDA, we've looked at things in the press, and here's something that has to do with CME. So when some of the speakers who were being paid by Merck began to tell their audiences that Vioxx was dangerous, that it increased cardiovascular risk, they were threatened by a Merck vice president. They were called, they were threatened, you'll get your grants removed and all sorts of things. And they were some of them were dropped from the speakers roster. It turned out that not only was Merck watching the Merck speakers, but Merck guys were watching the Pfizer speakers. So everybody's kind of spying on each other and making sure that they're following the company line. And this was a symposium at the American Heart Association meeting in 1999. You know, it may not be particularly relevant today, but this only came out from a settlement that was reported in January of this year. So it turned out that there were paid consultants from Bristol Myers Squibb who were promoting the drug Vanlev, which never made it on the market, thank God, in the meetings of the American Heart Association, promoting it even though they knew that several patients almost died from anaphylaxis. And these are guys who were being paid by BMS as speakers. And then there's this brochure for the public from the National Anemia Action Council. Sounds like the American Heart Association. Well, it turns out the National Anemia Action Council, which, by the way, promotes the use of EPO for off-label uses, is basically 26 academics. More than a third of them have financial ties to Amgen that makes EPO. And EPO is, of course, made by Amgen, and Amgen pays for the website, pays for the publication of this nice brochure, and it hints on that, you know, it talks about, well, there's a small study of EPO in congestive failure and in diabetes. It's a lot of junk in terms of evidence. It's just simply a marketing tool. And then they also market it to doctors as well in emails. So we have clinical practice guidelines that have been tainted by conflict of interest, and these are just some of them here. I'm not going to go into a lot of them, but I thought I would show you one that was reported in yesterday's New England Journal, and that was a report about Zigris. So the Society of Critical Care Medicine, which is probably one of the most conflicted medical societies in the United States, has recommended that this drug Zigris, or Zigris, which costs about $6,000 per infusion, that it was part of a guideline development, and that it should be bundled into pay-for-performance measures, even though there was tremendous controversy about its efficacy, about its risk, and of course its cost. It turned out that they were working with other societies to try to get them to approve their guidelines, and the Infectious Disease Society of America refuses to endorse it. Well, Lilly paid for the guideline development. The participants were Lilly paid consultants, and Lilly also gave a $1.8 million grant to study the ethics of rationing in the intensive care unit. In other words, why aren't you giving Zygris? And then they also went on a roadshow. They have Lilly's Surviving Sepsis campaign. So here you have a company that has engaged a lot of doctors to push this very expensive drug, and the drug has a lot of controversy about its efficacy and risk. So what do you have here when you're dealing with a lot of people who are conflicted? Well, there's a phenomenon in the military called incestuous amplification, which is a condition in warfare where one only listens to those who are already in lockstep agreement, reinforcing set beliefs and creating a situation ripe for miscalculation. You know, it's kind of an intellectual conformity. Once you're in a group of people, it's very hard to say I disagree with the majorities. You know, I mean, you could even think about how this may have influenced our current conflict in the Middle East. And here's an example of the situation in clinical practice. So you have a woman who goes to a gynecologist with a fibroid is likely to have a myomectomy or a hysterectomy, whereas if she goes to an internist, she's likely to be sent to an invasive radiologist who will inject polyvinyl particles into the tumor. And the woman who goes to the gynecologist is going to be out of commission for a couple of weeks, whereas the woman who has this procedure is going to be out of commission probably just for a couple of days. So does it make any sense that a woman could get one treatment or another depending on the doctor she goes to? Not in my book. Speaking of my book, I'll mention it later. And here's an example of off-label use of a drug, another example. This one, to me, is pretty flagrant. So this is the drug Natracor. And the Natracor was approved by the FDA for intravenous infusion in the hospital for patients with acute congestive failure. So some doctors began to use it in their offices by infusion, and it was not meant to be used that way. So Johnson & Johnson, to their credit, put together a panel of physicians to look at the question, should it be given in the office? And they hired Gene Braunwald, one of the premier cardiologists, to head the panel. And he came up with the conclusion, to Johnson & Johnson's chagrin, that it should not be used in the office. Well, it turns out that the Medicare was spending a huge amount of money on this drug. And of course, who was paying for that? You and I were paying for that. And here's a quote from Dr. Larry Altschul, a cardiologist in West Islip, New York, who regularly treats 70 patients with Natracor. He said that he did not expect the committee's report to change his use of the drug. He said, quote, "We have quite a few people that are on this and that are doing wonderful on this thing. We are ethically bound to continue this medication because of what we see it's doing in the appropriate patient." And then it says Medicare pays for most of the outpatient treatments at a rate of $600 per infusion, not including any fees the doctor charges. So in 2001, it reached $400 million. Now, because of its toxicity to the kidneys, the use of this drug has fallen off. But you can see the enticement of using this drug with incredible cost. And this I'm just going to show to give you a notion of how densely the pharmaceutical industry has infiltrated academia. Here's an article about modafinil, a drug that kind of keeps you awake a little bit. And this is about shift work. And this article is mildly positive, and I don't know why the New England Journal published it, but they did. And the interesting thing to read is that Dr. Seisler, who's the first author, it says, Dr. Seisler and Dingus report having received consulting fees and speakers' fees, this is the disclosure statement, from cephalon and so forth and so forth. Then it says Dr. Seisler serves as the incumbent of an endowed professorship provided to Harvard University by cephalon. So Dr. Seisler is the cephalon professor at Harvard. It turns out that the editorial that goes with the article, shown on the left lower part of the slide, basically says that the drug is of no value. Now, here's the problem, and I'm sure, does everybody know who this guy is? Mark Felt? Deep throat. Yeah, he's deep throat. So this is the kind of problem that you face when you're dealing with conflict of interest. So when Mark Felt came out of the closet and said he was deep throat, people were saying, well, what was his motivation? Was he just a red-blooded American? He was angry at what Nixon was doing to the country? Or did he have ulterior motives? And the ulterior motive in this case was that he had not been promoted to head of the FBI when J. Edgar Hoover died. So this is the problem of conflict of interest. You have to read somebody's mind. You don't, and the question is, what are you trying to understand? Well, are they just true believers? I mean, are they completely objective about the data? Somebody who's conflicted and telling you something about a drug, or in their what they're doing is completely subconscious. They don't even realize that they're promoting a drug when they have this conflict, or maybe they really do know and they're looking through the data with green-colored glasses. So I'll skip that. So what do you do about this? Well, I think we should not have 7 of the 9 people on a panel to deal with statins conflicted with companies that make the statins. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. We should have people who are good at analyzing data, but not conflicted people. There's no evidence that people who are not conflicted are not as well off analyzing data as people who are conflicted. So I think what we need to do is minimize the number of conflicted experts on these panels, and that we should allow the conflicted experts to testify but not to make the judgments. So this is what we look like now. It says, when you're ambulatory, be sure to check out my line of post-op merchandise in the gift shop. Well, we don't want to look like that. We don't want to be thought as on the take by the public. And so the principles I went into before, what about them? Well, I think gifts can bias therapeutic choices. That biased clinical information can lead to flawed clinical choices. That marketing promotes the latest and the most expensive treatments. That these financial arrangements are largely hidden, and that basically the fundamental problem that concerns me is that it injures our professionalism and damages the trust between ourselves and our patients. So I think we should not be taking reprints from the drug reps, or pens and coffee cups, or textbooks. Even though textbooks are supposed to be good for patient care, we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be taking lunches and pizza, dinners, free continuing medical education, stock and stock options. We shouldn't be doing any of these. On the other hand, there's a reason to believe that some of the things that have come out of industry are the consequence of the connections between industry and academia, and therefore we shouldn't destroy that connection, but we have to be very careful about it. And the same is true of joint research. I'm in favor of that. So some colleagues of mine and I, a few months ago, made a proposal that academic medical centers should be the first to clamp down on this. And it turns out that some of them are doing that. Your own medical school here has developed a new conflict of interest policy, as has Stanford and Penn and UC Davis and a number of others, and there's some other kinds of activities going on in the House of Representatives and the Senate Finance Committee. So, and there's even a bill that would bar FDA advisors with ties to the drug industry. I can tell you that that's probably not going to fly. And finally, this is my conflict of interest, the book that was referred to. It's has been shown around the country by others in an effort to get people to think twice about conflict of interest and to denigrate it, the idea, saying that it's really not important. And it's also been shown by the president of Johns Hopkins, who's recommending people to buy it. So take your choice and take a look at it or not. Thank you very much. There is, of course, a backlash. This Dutchman has said, problems worthy of attack prove their worth by hitting back. So it's a little like the notion that when the flak gets heaviest when you're over the target. So my view is that conflict of interest is a serious problem, hasn't been dealt with adequately yet, and we are still need a lot more to do with it. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. It's been a pleasure to be at this university, and I have had a great time here and have enjoyed it a lot. Thank you again. Do we have time for questions, or? Huh? Sure. I mean, I don't want to take up your time. It's 10:25. Okay, I'll take a couple questions. Marty.
Gary, sort of a two-part question. First of all, do you think that the long, detailed disclosure statements that are now part of every journal really have made any difference? And the second is, given your background as an editor, is there anything more that the editors of premier journals can do to deal with this issue?
Well, disclosure is really, I really didn't get a chance to talk about disclosure, and I think Jennifer will talk a little bit about it. I think disclosure is valuable in research papers. I think that disclosure is a sham in review papers and a sham in editorials. The problem is that that the journals that are allowing people to write review articles, when you write a review article, you pick and choose what you're writing about. You obviously have an opinion about where the data are going. So you're faced really with a kind of guessing game to try to figure out whether the person who wrote this article, who is conflicted, has put his spin on the article. I wrote an editorial in the Globe about a month or two ago describing that experience as akin to reading tarot cards. You just don't know what to make of it. On the other hand, with research articles, as long as the data are there, you can decide for yourself, assuming that the data are accurate. So disclosure, it seems to me, is a flawed approach to maintaining integrity of research and of summarized information. I have a problem with that. The second question was, can editors do anything about it? Yeah, they can. They can try harder to get people to write review articles who are not conflicted. My policy when I was at the Journal was not to allow anybody to write a review article if they had a conflict of interest.
Is that really feasible in certain areas of research, or if everybody's on the take, so to speak, how do you do that?
Well, if everybody's on the take, it's a sad commentary on medicine. Any other questions? Yeah.
One of your slides mentioned the use of IV TPA in acute ischemic stroke. And as a neurologist, I'm interested in your
right.
opinion with regard to that, because there are many of us out in the community who have a sense that there may have been a problem with that data. What's your
well, yeah, I will. I'll repeat the question. One of the guidelines that I showed on the slide had to do with the use of TPA for stroke. And the question is, many people in the community have been concerned about the validity of the evidence on which the recommendations have been made. Did I get it right? Yes. Okay, so my concern about that had more to do with conflict of interest than the evidence itself. I can tell you the following. First, that The people who wrote those guidelines were, there were a large number of people who had a conflict of interest with Genentech. So my concern was that they may have biased the evidence in favor of the use of TPA for stroke. Now I can tell you also, I don't know a lot about the field, but I can tell you that in academic medical centers and as compared to community health centers, the evidence, the results of using TPA for stroke are different. In the academic medical centers, they seem, the data, the results seem better than in the community settings. That may be simply a function of the fact that the community settings haven't geared themselves up in a way to deal with acute stroke. I can tell you that in some community centers, they do a smashing job of dealing with acute stroke with TPA. But my concern only had to do with the issue of conflict of interest, and I detail it in my book.
Can you just briefly address, getting away a little bit from the pharmaceutical industry, what we're seeing a lot of now with physicians getting into like lasers in their office?
Yeah.
Supplements.
Well, did you see this morning's New York Times by any chance? Well, yeah, I mean, it's a front page by Alex Berenson. I actually helped her with that analysis. But there's a new device that is used to diagnose carpal tunnel syndrome and other neurologic disorders. And it's being widely used by general practitioners in their offices, and they are billing it at a rate of, I don't know, $250 a test. And people who are, and then the neurologists are up in arms about that because they think that basically the practitioners don't know what they're doing, and they're even missing diagnoses like brain tumors. So the neurologists are arguing with the primary care docs about using this test, and the company is now threatening the neurologists to sue them if they continue to say bad things about their product. So with respect to devices of all kinds, this kind of thing is going on. Well, you might just read Alex Berenson's paper from this morning. There are many other examples. We need to let Jennifer talk, because she's terrific.